This is Gregory Castell, and I am going to be reading my daily journal from a trip I took to the Canadian Arctic during the summer of 1989. We were paddling on the river for about 28 days, and we kayaked roughly 350 miles down the Coppermine River in the Northwest Territories of Canada. The instructors were Jimmy Dunn and Bill Gould. So when I refer to someone like Bill or Jimmy, those are one of the instructors. My journal is about 75 or 80 pages long, and I'll read most of it. I won't include every class note. It's fairly extensive and specific concerning coordinates and locations, so I'll skip through a lot of stuff. But the first thing I'd like to say, and probably one of the most important things, is that I caught a lot of fish in this trip, and we ate a tremendous amount of fish. I'm just looking at a chart I kept of the fish, and I have just ones that I wrote down. I have about 15, most of which range between 3 to 10 pounds. We ate trout and grayling and char, which is a type of salmon. Journal entry 1, June 15th, 1989. The weather was partly cloudy, breezy, cold. We camped on a beach peninsula last night across the lake from a cabin. The first thing we noticed was that the buds had just bloomed several days ago. There was a lot of ice in the lake. The most obvious thing I sensed about the environment was the height of the trees and the shrubs. There was a great sense of openness. Our group came across a duck's nest which contained 6 eggs. I learned that because of evolution, the color of the eggs, white, was irrelevant. The female duck was camouflaged enough, and she sat on the eggs all the time, so they had lost their need to be camouflaged. Bill explained to us how to pack and correctly handle the boat when we were near the shore. We seemed to be cheerful despite the bad weather. For the first time, we felt sphagnum moss. With its acidic qualities, it is great for all types of cleaning. Most of the scattered trees are white spruce. I saw a root growing from one tree to another, and that's why this is like this. Apparently all the trees grow from one root to the other. Or most trees grow from one tree to another tree through the roots, and instead of dropping seeds on the ground, it's a different type of growth. June 16th, 1989. Morning, it was cold and breezy. In the afternoon, it was clear and warm. We had our first seminar today concerning the history of the Arctic peoples, Indians and Eskimos, the time periods of the cultures. Following this class, we set out to find a site where there was supposed to be some canoes and paddles, probably an old camp. Anyway, we never found it, but we did find some other interesting pieces. 1. We found a large piece of birch bark with a set of stitching holes, probably rolled and acted as a repair kit for the canoes. This was mostly buried in the moss. The exact measurements and details of this artifact were not recorded on the spot. We were not able to find it again. I guess this teaches us a lesson. Do it when you have it. A second piece of birch bark was found within 100 yards of the other on the point. It's 14 inches long. It was rolled over 3 times, and it had twin sets of stitching just like the other one. It was broken into 4 pieces. And we found a stone slab with some markings. We're not sure exactly what it used for. Maybe sharpening or something, but we're not very sure. We found a cut branch with much bark remaining. It was cut with 2 chops of an axe. We found another cut branch, and we found a log that was burnt. And you can see where it had been burned. These were most likely the remains of a camp it could have been a long time ago, because things are preserved very well in the Arctic. So it could have been Indians from 100 years ago that we found these artifacts. Having reviewed the day's material, I've come to several conclusions. First, when something is there, take down the details right then. Don't come back, because things are very hard to find in the tundra. This was obvious when Jimmy and Bill couldn't find the old site, as well as we couldn't find the birch bark. Secondly, anything could be an artifact. You have to train your eye to look for certain signals which might allow you to find an artifact. June 17th, 1989. The water temperature was 42 degrees. The weather was sunny, cool, and then it got partly cloudy. We saw some Canadian geese and merganser duck. After leaving campsite number 2, we handled our boats over the ice floe to the opposite side of the point where camp number 1 is located. Then, after a short paddle, portaged across another point where the ice was too thick to go around. We spent the rest of the afternoon paddling down Red Rock Lake. We came across 3 old squaws, birds, and I saw a male and a female red-breasted merganser duck. The land around here seemed so barren. More seagulls and terns. We broke camp just after the rapids on a hill near Jimmy's camp. At the site, or just near it, was an old bald eagle's nest, and Steve found some caribou antlers. It rained, and we had a short seminar on first aid before bedtime. Bill explained how to use the ELT transmitter, which is the emergency locating transmitter, and CB radios. Bill and I sat around the campfire before bed and just talked about the woods and camping. The most valuable conversations are usually the ones like this one. Sharing one's understanding with one another can be very enlightening. Note, artifact. During the portage around the point, due to ice, Jimmy found the remains of a birch bark canoe next to a spruce tree. It was incredible to see something like this for the first time. It was about 2 to 2.5 inches exposed. It was very overgrown with moss, but it was an old birch bark canoe we'd found next to a tree, probably used by the Hudson Bay Company or Indians. Maybe used the tree as a landmark, but it was never taken away. June 18th. Weather. It was partly to very cloudy in the morning with a very low ceiling. The showers, then clear in the afternoon to bright sunlight. Wind out of the west-northwest. Well, we had a very big day today. After taking 2.5 hours to break camp, where I incidentally caught 3 nice lake trout, we went through the Narrows, and Jimmy's group was just leaving. We put in a very full day of paddling. Had lunch on a hill on Rock Ness Lake, overlooking 4 islands. Bill took us to examine an esker, sediment from a river which was on a glacier. An esker is like a big dune, but it was because sediment left over from the glacial period. It was really fascinating, mostly sandy and probably 50 to 60 feet high. We saw a lot of scat, or wolf crap. And Bill felt like we might see some wolves. Steve and I found a camp, probably just a winter stopping place for snowmobiles. Lots of garbage and debris lying around. Jimmy explained how the Eskimos have always just thrown out what they use away without thinking about it, because it was always natural. It was white man who introduced the plastics to the Eskimo, and so in a way it is our own fault, because they haven't changed their style that much. It was an interesting fact to note about white man's relationship with the Eskimos and how he have affected them in very bad ways. Well, after catching some trout for dinner, Jimmy spotted some white wolves, 2 of them across the river. It was fantastic to see some wildlife for the first time. The wolves were examining us closely as we were watching them. It is their land in the first place. These were tundra wolves, and were snow white. Next, we spotted a bald eagle in flight, flying up the river. As it turned out, we saw a lot of wild animals. Early in the day, we saw a surf scoter fly overhead and an Arctic loon. Bill explained to me the differences between the tundra and the timber wolf, and how the timber are usually darker in color. We ate some great trout for dinner as well to top off a great night. June 19th, 1989. The weather, clear skies, very warm, mild wind. We're only 1 mile from the previous camp. When we first got up and had eaten breakfast, we had noticed that the river had risen a little bit, maybe 1 to 2 feet on the shore, so possibly an inch or less. Later that evening, we discussed that maybe due to the warm weather, the permafrost thawed, and this excess water was deposited in the river. This is the most likely possibility because there was only a little rain, not enough to bring it up that much. Permafrost is 12 inches under the ground to 18 inches under the ground. It's frozen all the time, but since we were there in early summer for them, which is middle to late June, the land was still thawing. By night the river had risen to over our cooking pots, and so we moved all the equipment up. Just after breakfast that morning, we had a seminar on mapping, and Jimmy and Bill explained the Universal Transverse Mercator Grid Coordinate System. It's a very technical military grid system used, and you can pinpoint your location down to about 10 yards. We practiced it and measured out the watershed area of a lake, which feeds into the copper mine. After a little frustration, we finally figured out that it was approximately 8.5 times 10 to the 8th square meters, which is incredibly large. Because of the permafrost, very little water is absorbed into the ground, so the runoff is tremendous, and the river is due to fluctuate much more than rivers south of the permafrost area. Before we left camp in the morning, we also spotted a river otter swimming in the rapids, which, I believe, is quite rare for this area. Usually, they are found south of here. The herring gulls were diving at the otter, but the Bonaparte gulls, gray wings, white undercoat, and black hands, were not. It was uncommon to see the two types of gulls together. After we arrived at the rapids and Jimmy and Bill had explained the layout of the water, all of us ran them except for two people. We did all right. We got a little bit wet in our first set of rapids. John caught a nice 20-pound lake trout, and we all ate trout for dinner. It was absolutely enormous. After dinner, we all met, talked about how to map a rapids, then went out and did it. We saw several more Arctic loons fly overhead during dinner. At the landing site of this camp, we came across a bouncy section of clay which had water underneath it. It was particularly odd because there were rocks, big rocks on top, and looked all the same, but had H2O, had water running under it. The water from the plateau, which is above the permafrost, runs down the hill and into the river. This creates a stream underground, and the clay above it is like a trampoline. Something we noticed when we were clearing the fish, the stomachs of the fish were filled with mud puppies, or little bottom feeders. I also found a weird stone, or combinations of stone. One was a chert, and it was wrapped around a big chunk of some type of sandstone. June 20th. The nest we spotted during our walk this morning was located under some brush in a mound of moss. It was very difficult to spot. The nest was lined with very soft white feathers, possibly ptarmigan feathers, and there were 4 eggs. We had our seminar that morning on journal guidelines. Bill explained in detail how we should approach our explanations of the things we observe, but also at the same time maintain a flexibility and style. The walk where we had found the nest was an extremely educational one. Just following Bill around and listening to him talk about the different flowers and birds is extremely beneficial to my understanding of the Arctic life. Bill pointed out the alpine azalea, the crowberry, the dwarf birch, which is the most common of all tundra trees, or so it seems, the willows, the Labrador tea, the Lapland rosebay, the rosemary, sedgegrass. Other things we came across during the walk were items like a set of caribou antlers, a bone, most likely caribou, which had been broken and chewed up by another animal, most likely a wolf. Moose excrement and caribou excrement were also spotted. A particular interesting idea concerns vegetative reproduction. This is where the trees, mostly white spruce, grow out their roots, and then other trees spring up from these roots. I found it fascinating to think how they have adapted so well to live in the permafrost. Another fact concerning trees relates to the tree line. The tree line has been receding for the past 500 years or so due to certain changing conditions of the weather. This is or will have a tremendous impact on the environment. One question I have concerns the rate of decay in the Arctic. Today, when we found some small rain ponds on the tundra, and I saw some bubbles, these probably were due to decaying organic compounds resulting in, I believe, methane gas. I would imagine that the rate of decay for both animals and plants and trees is very slow. How does this affect the environment? We paddled one set of rapids this afternoon, but it took us all day. It was very difficult and dangerous, and had to do it in sections with Jimmy and Bill running the boats through at places. It was fun, but took a lot of time and scouting. We pitched camp just upriver from the other group, caught 2 grayling, one about 1.5 to 2 pounds, and the other 2 to 3 pounds. June 21st, 1989. It was 41 degrees Fahrenheit at 10:30 in the morning, very cold and damp, an extremely low ceiling, and it was drizzled on and off all day. We took the day off today due to miserable weather conditions. In the morning we had a seminar on dendroecology. Jimmy explained in rough detail about how dendroecology works in conjunction with other sciences to confirm certain events in the ecological history. The rings of each tree are measured by means of a borer and studied to understand the ecological relationships over time. Jimmy also talked about the different current studies and areas of interest for dendroecologists. The grayling I caught yesterday were quite distinctive in their features than most fish. The dorsal fin was unusually large, and it had bluish-purple spots on the side. The grayling seemed to occupy the river in the eddy, right where the ground drops off into the deeper water. Both of the fish hit at roughly the same spot on the same MEP spinner. Bill demonstrated how to fillet the fish, and the meat had a different texture than trout. It seemed more flaky. June 22nd. It was 39 degrees at 6:30 in the morning, very cold, gray, the humidity near 100%. Rain on and off all day, late in the afternoon clearing, breaking clouds, and sunny by 2100 hours. Cool and still at 2300 hours. This morning we had a seminar conducted by Bill on vegetation mapping using 2 different systems. We each mapped out a section on the riverbank in the rain. Paddled all afternoon. One heavy set of rapids needed scouting, but other than that, just quick water and some lakes. Very tiring. We saw another river otter across the Hepburn near the other camp. June 23rd. It was clear and sunny all day. No clouds. The wind varying from the south. Beautiful day. Today we traveled 23.5 miles by kayak. Our seminar this morning focused on geomorphology. Jimmy explained in particular fluvial geomorphology, or basically the effects of river on the changing of land, as in land erosion. We collected as a group certain information about the river characteristics such as average depth, velocity, gradient, sketches, and width. With this information, we plan to put together a full report on the data. In the afternoon, we paddled through a lot of fast water and many sets of rapids. We heard 2 planes and saw one of them. Other than that, we had a fairly uneventful day. Ate love burgers, which is a type of bean which you make into a burger, and had fresh onions. And now we must prepare for an exam. We have an exam the next day, our midterm exam. June 24th. It was extremely clear, no clouds at all, very sunny and warm. There was a slight breeze from the south, building by afternoon to strong gusts. Today we will have traveled 12 miles. Having completed the exam, and after lunch, we set off down the river. On the left side of the expansion, before the whitewater, we saw an old, very dented canoe, possibly left by a fisherman, but we would like to believe it was one where the guy was killed 10 years ago. When the river got wider, the end of the rapids, we noticed that the silt was extremely fine and had dissolved in the water, making it a smoky blue-green, almost tropical color. Shortly after, we came across a moose, a cow, the female moose, which had a very light coat. It examined us just as closely as we examined it. The cow was near the water, ran up the hill, came back down, went right into the water's edge as I paddled right at it, walked a little around, just gazing at us, then took off up the hill. Besides the wolves, this is the first interaction we've had with the wildlife. The wildlife up here is truly wild, because in southern Canada and much of the U.S., the moose know how man acts and have always known to run, when we come near. Up here, the cow probably has never seen a human before. This experience was truly one of the first encounters with a wild animal where both groups are interested in the other to a great extent. There was a single Arctic swan flying overhead just about 5 miles after the moose spotting. The banks of the river and the riverbed shores, clearly have fine sand, show how fine sand easily erodes, and the sediment can be transported in great quantities. The seminar Jimmy conducted 2 days ago on geomorphology was much clearer now that we have paddled in this type of terrain. The trees were falling into the river. It is for reasons like this where we experience what has been taught just after that is very interesting. We learn something and the next day we go out and we experience it. The information being taught therefore seems more valuable because it has applications, whereas at school it all seems theoretical. The campsites where we landed in the remains the campsite where we landed is the remains of an old camp. We found an opening where there was a fire, and we found stakes and a teepee pole, all hand chopped with the bark still remaining. We found about 4 or 5 stakes. We also found a robin's nest up in a white spruce about 7 feet with 3 baby robins in it. June 25th. It was clear skies and sunny, 5 to 10 knot breeze blowing from the south again. Not a cloud in the sky, same all day. Today we traveled 13 miles. Location? We slept in till 9:30 this morning, then paddled all day, and then paddled solo. We paddled alone all day for about 3 hours. In this 7 to 8 mile stretch, approximately a quarter to a half mile wide, I observed a lot of Arctic swans and ducks. One barnapark gull attacked me when I came too close to shore where his nest was located. The erosion of the riverbanks and the constant changing of the river course was even more obvious after today. There were lots of very high cliffs on either side where the river had cut through and continued. When we arrived at the campsite, Jimmy found a set of bear prints, probably grizzly. They were about 6 inches to 7 inches in length and 4 inches in width. We, of course, put our tent right next to them. Another interesting feature at the site are the stones. There were many little coin-shaped stones varying from 1/4 to 2 to 3 inches in diameter, which were probably round. The other sides there is a slight bulge. Steve and I were talking about it, and they may have been where the clay had bubbled up. However, after I got back to Walpole during Christmas, Brian suggested maybe they were formed in the eddies of the water, where the water had spun around and created a circle. While paddling today, I also saw 2 oil drums, rusty, on the right bank of the river. I think that paddling alone for the afternoon was a good idea. I thought about how each individual sees the environment. Some look at the environment almost purely to observe what exists and how it lives in the wild. Others will use the loneliness of the woods to look at themselves. I believe to do too much of one or the other is improper and not a balanced process. June 26th. We only traveled 4 miles today. It was sunny with increasing winds in the afternoon, clouds to the far southeast, but clear to the north. On the paddle up to our seminar location, we saw a single swan fly overhead. The seminar focused on geographic mapping systems. Following the seminars, we set out to plot a 100-meter by 50-meter rectangle and divide it into 10-meter squares. However, we did not know if to plot them by surface distance or by horizontal distance. As it turned out, the day was a very, very long day, tiring, and even to map out an area 100 meters by 100 meters into grids is very, very difficult and took a great deal of cooperation. This seminar ended up taking all afternoon, and we ended up camping at the same spot for the evening. We worked on this probably 6 or 7 hours. As I think about it, it was probably the first real time the group had worked together under difficult circumstances. June 27th, 1989. It was very sunny with winds shifting from the south to the north, then back to the south, threatening clouds indicating a passing front, but at 2300 hours the sky is very clear and the clouds have seemed to pass. We traveled 15 miles today. This morning Bill conducted a seminar concerning the plants in the Arctic and how they act as indications of conducted a seminar concerning the plants in the Arctic, how they act as indications of animals, climate, soil, and how the use of the plant and how to use the plant press. We each found a plant, sketched it, looked at it, looked it up in the book, and pressed it. My flower was an anemone. We weren't sure if it was the multifida or the Drummondi, but in any case, we did our research into the flowers. At this campsite, Matt, John, and I went for a hike about 4 to 5 miles. At the top, we discovered some very interesting rock positions and conditions. One rock had almost entirely been eaten away by lichens, which is a type of moss, indicating that it was very old. Another rock, about 3 to 4 feet in length, was nesting on 3 small baseball-sized stones. Several other rocks had been precariously placed at the edge of the hill. The position of these rocks and the landscape around us indicates very clearly the movement and activity of the glaciers. The land seems to have been carved out by the glaciers, creating some of the oldest rocks in the world. June 28th, 1989. The weather today was clear and cool in the morning with cirrus clouds to the west and north, very warm and breezy with winds up to 10 miles per hour from the south. By 9 p.m., the front seems to have moved in, but still very sunny. We traveled 14 miles today on the river. This morning, Jimmy lectured on the overwhelming topic of geographic research, explaining and defining the proper way to write a proposal, to approach different systems of analyzation, and conducting research. In particular, he outlined qualitative versus quantitative research, and for an argument and for an assignment, we have to write either an abstract or review. On the paddle today, we saw many terns, a bald eagle, and a flock of seven swans. This area of the river most fascinates me because of its easily eroding characteristics. There were fewer of the high cliffs today, but some smaller ones were still seen. The depth of this area of the river was relatively shallow, 4 to 7 feet, approximately. I am curious how this affects ice and water flow, because water is warmer in the summer, but probably freezes the first. I would assume it's areas like this where the river would back up. I have and am getting accustomed to the constant hum of the mosquitoes, which have been plaguing us for 2 days. The wind is the only relief, and in the colder weather, they don't seem to be as bad. The calm, peaceful river feels to be like the calm before the storm, where the rapids and whitewater are frequent and heavy. June 29th. Today we traveled 13 miles. The weather was warm and sunny all day, the temperature ranging in the mid-70s with little to no wind. Very humid and still. Very flat water. After a morning of paddling and setting up camp, Bill conducted a seminar on nesting and birds. He assigned us a project to map out a grid, divided into squares, and we were then supposed to make a rough sketch of our area and record the results if we found any data concerning the density of the nests and the eggs. We searched for nests within our areas, and I found nothing in my area, so it seemed to be relatively unsuccessful Anyway, after dinner we had a powwow and some assignments were handed back, with general comments. We then had a discussion about certain attitudes towards the course concerning the amount of work. Jimmy and Bill are right in that we are doing a lot of work, but it is a 6-hour credit course. We don't really have a lot of reason to complain, because it's what we are here for. We are not accustomed to combining camping and researching. It seems we are adjusting, but we are still trying to get through the material instead of into it. I feel as if I have learned a tremendous amount of material in the course thus far and have no regrets. I will only receive 1 academic credit, which equals about 4 hours of semester credit. Side 2. Journal entry number 16, June 30th. Today we traveled 13 miles. The weather was overcast with scattered clouds, then short showers around midday. Clearing in the afternoon, around dinner, showers and gusty. At bedtime it was rainy, gray, and cold, in the 50s. An interesting feature in the river that we noticed today was that the river, which was wide and was an expansion, almost like a lake, was dumped through a very small section, which Jimmy calls the gateway. This resulted in the pace of the river, the rate of the river, increased a great deal, and from here on in until the end of the trip, we knew that we were bound to have whitewater every day. It seems that the excitement would soon be picking up, and that the flat water, which is very tiring and difficult to maneuver, is very tiring to paddle in, had ended. When we went through this gateway, which was it was sort of a little small area where the river got narrower, we had to be very careful because this is the first time we were paddling in whitewater. The character of the river changes dramatically. One can actually feel the river and the environment change. Here the river picks up pace, going from a 2 to 3 foot mile drop to 16 feet per mile drop and up. If the river drops 2 to 3 feet in a mile, rivers run downhill, then there is very, very, very slow water. If the river has a drop of 16 feet within a mile, that means that the river is going downhill at a very fast pace. That, in turn, indicates you have rapids. We are camping at a popular spot where all the whitewater rafting companies put in for their trip to Coppermine. A lot of trees and shrubbery have been cut. Across the way is a hill with all sand, and several times during the night there were small rock or dirt slides. July 1. Journal entry number 17. We traveled 9 miles today. The weather was overcast and rainy with strong gusty winds, on and off showers all day, mid-40s to 50s. I have a lot of information on this day from a sketch I did of a micro-habitat. I went and found a very, very small area. It was a puddle, and I sketched what the puddle looked like, and I picked one creature from the puddle and sketched it. It turned out to be a mosquito larvae, which is very, very common in this part of the country. And I examined it and sketched it, and there's very little else in this entry besides this information on the insect. At the site I caught a char, Arctic char, which is a member of the salmon family, about 4 to 5 pounds. The meat was very healthy and pink like salmon. The fish did not taste fishy at all. The skin was unusually smooth, and I cut my finger very badly. Journal entry number 18, July 2nd. Today we traveled 17 miles. The weather was very cold, about 38 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning and up to 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon. Overcast with on and off showers and occasional light snow. Winds from the north. After taking the exam this morning, about 5 hours long, we paddled a very tough section into headwind with rolling waves going against the strong current. Once we passed the several-mile stretch, we went through some very windy, rocky terrain with mountains shooting up from the river. In one set of short rapids, I got stuck in the eddy while trying to take some pictures, and the power of the eddy almost caused me to swamp. The water came right up to the edge of the boat. At one point during the very windy, rocky portion, we came across a golden eagle and drifted right to the base of the tree on which it was perched. It was incredible to be able to see every detail in the eagle with my binoculars. It had an extremely hooked beak, and when it flew shortly after, the wingspan was enormous. After dinner, Jimmy explained to us how to play blackjack with betting only $5 at a time, then doubling the money if you lost, always adhering to the system. You couldn't lose, but come out $5 ahead each time. Kate and I took a hike to the top of the hill, and the view was spectacular. The open tundra was finally apparent. There were several flowers we have not yet seen in abundance, and we brought them to Jimmy, who said they were campion. Journal entry number 19, July 3rd. The weather was partly cloudy with scattered light showers and partial sun in the mid-40s degrees Fahrenheit. We traveled only 1 mile today. We had a day off. All we did was portage our gear to the other side of the Rocky Defile Rapids. It could be possible to run Rocky Defile Rapids, but it would take a good amount of strength and quite a bit of skill. The eddies along the way would almost be impossible to enter because the current would be going too fast in both directions. Once you got into the eddy, if you could, it would be extremely difficult to exit. The waves are curling, not just breaking, indicating that the current is very strong. On the hillside, the land has taken quite a bit of abuse due to a mixed number of portage trails. There was especially a lot of erosion where the hill started off the rocky shore. Last night, we had a good talk about a number of different things with Jimmy. It was very educational. On the beach, just at the bottom of the rapids, near our camp, I found a lot of plastic bags and trash. Small spruce and willow had been crushed along the portage trail. After dinner, Kate brought the rest of the group to a dead gyrfalcon. The wingspan was about 38 inches and the body was 18 inches long. It was found on the downside of a cliff. It had been dead for quite some time because it was stuck to the grass. The flesh on the bird was still intact, showing how things decompose very, very slowly in the Arctic. The head was darkest part and the body white with brown flecks. It was photoed and recorded. Journal entry number 20. 16 miles were traveled today. The weather was sunny with scattered clouds, then warm and sunny all afternoon with strong, gusting winds from the north. Clouds were high up and looked as if they were smeared due to high winds. During the paddle this morning, we saw a lot of cliff swallows, about 6 miles from the previous camp. At this same place, we saw a gyrfalcon when we flushed it out from a spot where it was sitting. During the whole expansion, we stayed too far left of the islands, except at the end. The wind was blowing very hard. In the morning, at the top of the hill, we saw 2 golden eagles soaring down the canyon. Just after we started paddling, we saw another golden eagle and a merlin falcon. On one part of the river, there was a great deal of small rocks pushed up on the bank, creating a very steep slope. This was on the outside of the bend, and it was due to ice movement. Journal entry number 21. July 5th, 1989. Today we traveled 37 miles. That shows that the rate at which the rate of the river had increased a great deal today, and we made very, very good distance. The weather was clear in the early morning, then becoming very cloudy among midday and all afternoon, threatening to storm, but no precipitation. The wind was from the west. During the paddle today, we came across 2 golden eagles and 2 nests. Another interesting item we saw today were large sections of ice on the shore where Melville Creek emptied into the copper mine. The ice at spots was 5 to 6 feet thick, indicating that the actual thickness was probably twice that. There were many shoals in this area, and we stayed to the far right. Also, the ice had pushed the stones up to a steep hill on the outside bend of this turn where we were camping. We came across a group today who were on a fishing trip. They were about 3 to 5 miles upriver from our campsite. There were 8 people in 2 boats who had 2 video cameras, and they filmed us when we passed by. The huts they stayed in were 3 in number and were just canvas laid over a wooden frame which stays up all year. One of the guides lives there. One is for supplies and one is for cooking, or so Jimmy told me. The other group stopped by and went into the camp and was served beer. Wow, we went by without going in. We could have had some beer, but we missed it. During the paddle, we also observed what appeared to be some government apparatus for monitoring the river flow. It was nestled in on the left side about 5 miles above the fishing camp. We ran out of hot chocolate and chocolate bars last night. That was a big deal. The large sections of ice on the shore were covered in dirt due to deposits from previous layers of melting. Journal entry number 22, July 6. We traveled 15 miles today. It was overcast and windy with intermittent light showers, strong wind from the north, gusting to high winds. When we left camp today, we noticed that we had left a lot of food remaining and obvious human campsite impact. There was Crisco smeared on the rocks, different spices were sprinkled on the rock, fish blood remained on the rock, and a stick was nesting on top of a rock, which acted as a marker. All of these made it obvious that humans had camped at the spot, and it takes away from the pristine value of the land. The paddle to Muskox Rapids was a very difficult and trying task. We ended up stopping for about 2 hours, hoping the wind would die, but it didn't. We all paddled most of Muskox Rapids except the last leg, where we lifted over our gear just over the peninsula. We approached the rapids on the left and sneaked around the first large waves into the eddy near the end. The rapids flushed out, there were no obstacles, and runnable if you are willing to get wet and think you have the skill to stay in the boat. Just after the set, we observed a rough-legged hawk. It was a long day. We had made camp at about 9:30 p.m. and ate about 10:30 p.m. Tomorrow, we have more than 10 sets of rapids to run, and we need a good night's sleep. July 7th. Journal entry number 23. Today we traveled 9 miles. Well, today was a doozy. After working on our projects in the morning, we started the longest, most difficult day of the journey. We were supposed to go from Sandstone Rapids to Escape Rapids. Not too far in the mileage, but 13 sets of rapids stood in the way. We got past the first 3 at Sandstone, shot right around the island, and left of the small island at the Narrows. There were big standing waves. Then, at the next set, we stayed way right. We bailed our boats out again. This next set, where there were 2 in a row, was the hairy set. We had set out about the middle of the river, and there were high standing waves. But then we hit a huge shelf. 3 boats were overturned. Pat's, Steve's, and Alex's. Alex managed to right his, while I watched him. John helped Pat, and Matt helped Steve. We all worked together as a team, each one person helping another person. We then struggled to the far right at the second set and after some shoals and found camp. The wave which flipped 3 people out of their boats was a shelf, creating a hole about 1.5 boats across and 1 boat length in length. A boat length is about 12 feet, so this hole was about 18 feet across and 12 feet in depth. My boat skimmed across and I paddled really hard to clear the eddy. Bill and Jimmy walked back and up and ran the other boats down because the people, Steve and Katie, were too shaken up. We all laughed to relieve the stress. After dinner, we climbed the hill above the tents and saw another lone caribou. We were on what Russ and Jimmy thought to be a pingo, where ice had been expanding and continually freezing, forcing the land at this point up. There are no trees. There are also 2 huge nests along the river on the side of the cliff, probably eagle or falcon. We were careless today, and we got out of it fairly safely. We were all alive. On this page, I have about 10 mosquitoes mushed in the book. I call it the Arctic Museum of Mosquitoes. It's journal entry number 24, July 8th. We traveled 12 miles. After a bad night's sleep and very cold, rainy weather, we set off paddling in the morning until we got to Escape Rapids. We ran 5 sets of rapids, staying to the middle inside of each. We saw more caribou along the top of the riverbank. For the portage, we paddled to the left, and it was a very, very difficult long portage. Journal entry number 25. We traveled 11 miles today. The weather was sunny and clear. It was in the 70s, and it was an all-around beautiful day. After spending the morning on our proposals, we paddled to Bloody Falls for the 1 to 1.5 mile portage, which was on the right side of the river. We stopped along the way at a point where a stream fed into the lake where Bloody Falls is located, so Steve could collect some data. John noticed that there were some fish. As it turned out, there was an entire school of grayling, which, after we caught the first few, we had been feeding on little minnows. Alex and I found a bunch of dead minnows in a little puddle just upstream and fed the fish. We all caught fish with 1 rod. We caught enough fish for dinner that night. Each person caught 1 or 2 fish within a minute or 2. When we got past all the shoals, we got to the top of the rapids, which were unrunnable because they were heavy whitewater, and we saw someone on the shore who was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP. As it turns out, we were the first group to come down the river this year. After dinner, I walked around the area where those 3 people had been hanging out and found a bunch of garbage, including cans, cartons, plastic bags. This was the point furthest down the river that one could go without having seen any kind of man. At this point in the river, until we got to Coppermine Village, was completely used by man. People would come up in boats to this set and fish and drink beer and hang out. So at this point, it was a change in the feeling of the river. There was a definite, obvious marks from man, whereas, the 25 days before this had all been relatively pristine. When we got past, let me see. It was strange to be back in civilization, where people have little respect for the environment. We have been living in very secluded areas for the past month, so maybe it is me who is different, but I don't think so. Journal entry number 26, July 10th, 1989. We got up this morning. Pat and Steve were cooking only a small portion of eggs and 2 greasy pieces of salami. Then later, I copied over my proposal, which was entitled Damaging Effects of Recreational and Commercial Campers Along the Coppermine River. It turned out to be 6 pages written, 14 pages with data. After lunch, John and I slowly packed our boats and were the first to leave. This was mid-afternoon. Everyone else was still looking over their proposals. John and I paddled for about 3 to 3.5 hours out to the mouth of the river, which was about 10 to 12 miles. It was definitely a good feeling to pull into a town. Bill and Jimmy both offered their congratulations to us. We had finally made it. We unpacked our boats and went straight to the local and only diner or restaurant, Hugo's. Hugh was the main owner, chef, who we also saw at Bloody Falls on that Sunday. Greasy cheeseburgers and sodas were consumed with much pleasure. Very good, and after a little chocolate soft-serve ice cream, how nice. Later, after Steve and Pat pulled in about 9 p.m., we all walked into town again. We checked out the hotel, $95 a night with dinner and breakfast, and the Bay Store, which was closed at 5:30 p.m. Everyone seems to be really nice. I called home, and of course Mom was surprised and happy to hear from me. I found out I got into my Australia program. Anyway, the four of us met these 3 kids: Adam, who was 11 years old, Richard, who was 17, and Keith, who was their cousin. All of them were Inuit, or Eskimo, and had lived in Coppermine their whole lives. They had a little cabin to the east of the hamlet where they would fish and hunt caribou. We talked with them for a long time, asking them many questions about their culture, and they were very open about it. We slept in our slept in our bivy sacks outside, and we had been exhausted, and the trip was starting to catch up with us. The others pulled in at about 4 in the morning after what was said to be an incredible paddle. Journal entry number 27, July 11th, 1989. After getting up at about 9:30 a.m. on a very sunny, warm day, the others slowly got up and said that when they had pulled in that morning, little kids were peeking up over the rocks and spying on our camp. It would be strange because a town with only 1,500 people, the size of Bowdoin College, a new group coming down the Coppermine is a big deal and obviously an attraction. Katie said that on the way, a little kid ran out of a cabin and was waving. It was like Fantasy Island, she said. The first thing we did was go straight to the Bay Store and gawk at all the food. We ended up only getting 6 jelly donuts, milk, and a couple of candy bars. We knew the entire day would be spent eating. After that, we walked around, went to the co-op, and looked at the gift selection, where there were a lot of stone and ivory carvings, along with many other crafts. It was pretty much the only place in town to buy native Inuit art. Well, we ate lunch and bummed around. We must have walked between camp and town a half a dozen times, we only camped about half a mile away from town. As it turns out, we ended up meeting the parents of these children, and we had tea with them, and we sat down and we talked to them for a while. They had a hatchet and a knife next to a big section of raw caribou meat, which had been frozen, and that was next to a pan full of thawing raw fish. They would just chop off a section of either the meat or the fish and have lunch. They would just eat the meat raw, right off of the floor. Very interesting and very different from what we are used to. The Inuit seem to be attractive listeners and usually will not offer conversation readily. This demonstrates the difference with the people I've been exposed to in my lifetime, who will babble without end and little meaning. Most of the Inuit are, by my standards, pretty ugly people. They're very short, they're very, very weathered, and large, round, fat faces. Hardly anyone has a car, They have 4x4s, which a four-wheeler, all-terrain vehicle, which are always cruising around the dusty roads. I bought some art. We were very tired by this time. We ate dinner, pizza at Hugo's, and then went to camp, where Jimmy commented on how we all compared to his expectations. This was a complimentary session, the only one, and Jimmy explained why he was so negative the whole trip. He was very nervous, he explained. Anyway, it was nice, and it could have acted as a buttering up, because we're going to write an evaluation of him and the course in the next several days. The meeting with Larry Whitaker, who was the head of the Chamber of Commerce of Coppermine in the town, came and talked with us about the town and the Arctic environment in general. It was great to talk with a knowledgeable white man. We went to the co-op after meeting and got breakfast and then went to the bed. In the course of 1.5 days, we had gotten to know the people in town very well. A lot due to Adam and Richard, the two Eskimo children we met, and we were exhausted. The trip was starting to take effect. I received an A- on my proposal and an A on my journal. A very good day. Jimmy said in the complimentary session that my paddling and river reading skills were excellent, and that I as well could lead my own trip. He also commented that my sketches and writing ability were some of the most advanced in the group. I don't know if he was being honest, but it was good to hear. He said I was doing graduate level work and that these research skills should definitely be exploited, quote unquote. It was weird. Maybe, whatever, we don't know. We leave at 11 a.m. tomorrow morning. It should be an exciting day, meeting the other group and everything. Today was the last day. After getting up around 7:30 in the morning, we packed up and did our clearing chores and paddled around the point to the float base, where the float plane was to pick us up. When we got to the float base and broke our boats down, another twin otter came in from Lupin, a gold mine up north, where some workers were getting off and some others were getting on. We talked with some of the Inuit about our trip. We saw many of the people in town we had seen in the last few days, and our plane came in at 10:40. We loaded it quickly. The plane flew right down the valley of the Coppermine River, all the way to Napictolic Creek, where the other group had been dropped off earlier that morning. I got off the plane with boots in hand, ready to sell. The black flies were out for the first time, and it was an experience that I would never forget. We all laughed at the second trip because they had to live with the unbearable hum and buzz and biting of the black flies, which we never even experienced. It was driving me crazy, and I wanted to get out of there. After a quick goodbye to Jimmy and Bill, I have a feeling that that both of the leaders are really going to miss us. Although we may have been a little strange and perhaps immature at times, we kind of grew on him, and I don't know how excited he was to deal with another 4 weeks of especially with a group of unexperienced, weak girls. The second trip, which our instructors led, was identical to the first one, but most of the people had less experience and were less tolerable to the environment. Anyway, we got on the plane, and our group was very happy. This was the last leg of a long journey. We made the flyby of the other group and could see the expression on their faces. I remember what that was like when we were dropped off in that ice-filled Red Rock Lake. Very strange and extremely lonely. After landing in Yellowknife and changing clothes, we all received ptarmigan pins, which was the name of the company. We went out, we saw a movie in the little village here, and after the movie, we all went back and we went to sleep. The sun was really low and a cool all-night sunset. It was very cool. We met John, Matt, and Alex on a corner where they were talking with 4 guys who were going down the copper mine tomorrow, and it was very interesting. We filled them in, then went in and went to bed. We were dead exhausted. July 13th. We got up, got out of our sleeping bags, packed the car, and headed up for the Wildcat Cafe to get those famous blueberry pancakes. They were great. John and I switched our flight to a 9:30 so we could fly down with Katie and said goodbye to the others. It was a great trip, but I felt that I wouldn't see these people again. Maybe, but it was one of those relationships where outside the adventure, the people will not seem the same, especially with time, because they will have readjusted to the environment that they are normally used to. We flew to Edmonton and said goodbye to Katie, who was continuing on to Chicago. I really liked her. She was very patient and could laugh at herself very easily. That's it, folks. My trip to the Canadian Arctic during the summer of 1989.